Good morning, and welcome to Casual T-Shirt Friday on AP Euro. Yes, I'm John Horton, and I'm back to fill your day with wonderful knowledge about the estate of World War I in 1917. Before we get started, I hope that you all are continuing to do all the good things that Mr. Turner talked about. I hope that you all, yes, wash your hands. I mean, I was a germaphobe when during the regular school year before this whole situation happened. Now, I just, yeah, this is kind of freaky. You never think about how many surfaces you touch all the time, and with the length that the virus stays on those surfaces, it just mandates being extra careful. But we'll do that, and then we'll get through this. And what I was talking about last night via email, I still stick by. I do fully believe that we're going to have an AP exam. I don't know by that time if they'll be allowing large meetings of people to have such an exam, but I also just, like I told you last night, I don't see the College Board sending back literally hundreds of thousands of refund checks to students across the country because they didn't get to take the AP exam. So I do think that'll be coming. That's why it's so important that we push on. Not to mention the fact that this is a course that is required for your graduation. Not AP Euro per se, but it fulfills the sophomore requirement for social studies. And so with that, and also if you know this drill, arts, humanities credit, that kind of business. So, we're going to run the race, and we're going to finish the race. So today we are talking about something slightly different, but it occurs during World War I, and it occurs because of World War I. And what that is basically the fall of the Tsarist regime in Russia, the revolution in Russia, and then touch base, and then the rise of communism. Communism was the most important political movement of the 20th century. Well, you're going to say, well, what about Nazism? Well, you have to remember that Nazism only lasted from 1933 to 1945 as a true influence. And so communism, the Russian brand, will last from 1922, literally, with the birth of the Soviet Union until 1991. And it will be a major affector of events in the world, and not just in Europe, but also in the entire world of the 20th century. Okay, so let's see, taking inventory again. I do hope, study guide, I do hope you have Mr. Penn. I do hope you have, I have to have that. I do hope, of course, you have this. And once again, while this may not be your drink of choice for the morning, if there is an advantage of teaching and learning from home, it's that, you can kind of put yourself in a comfortable place, and yeah. One day when this is all over, and it will be over, you'll miss these little fireside chats with Mr. Horton. And like I said last night, I think that maybe in the future that many of those chats may be coming from the Horton estate, which is really funny because my desktop computers, I love desktop computers. I never got laptops. I just don't like them. And My desktop office slash is in my bedroom. Try not to get too weirded out. Anyway, so let's begin. The March Revolution in Russia was neither planned nor controlled by any political faction. I mean, basically what had happened was it was literally, I mean, it's so similar to the French Revolution because you have a bumbling fool as monarch. You have one calamity after another, one war after another that they keep on coming up on the short side of. And more and more and more people just lost faith in the leadership of the czar. And so, even though the public had supported the war at first and Russia's entry, like I said, there was dancing. Even in Russia, there was, giant jubilations. The war placed too many strains on the resources of the Russian government. Nicholas II was weak and incompetent and suspected of being under the control of Grigory Rasputin. Whether he was or not, I've always told you that image is more important than reality. And Tsar Nicholas II had this image of having this weirdo homeless-looking guy living with him. And this weirdo homeless-looking guy, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but this weirdo guy who never took a bath and who never cut his hair, he did have certain influence. He could make certain political appointments, which really a lot of people found upsetting. Military and domestic failures produced massive casualties. Russia had the largest army at the beginning of World War I. They could put the most soldiers under arms. Well, they could put them in the service. That was part of the thing. The Russian army was woefully ill-equipped and woefully poorly led. I told you several times the story about, at the beginning of World War I, 1 in 4, touch face, 1 in 4 Russian soldiers didn't have a weapon. They were told to follow some guy who did have a weapon and then pick up that weapon. I will say also, in the spirit of being fair, I love to watch documentaries. I was watching a documentary called The Great War, and actually when the United States first starts arriving in the latter part of 1917, it too was ill-equipped, and the American Army gave many of its soldiers the same order. You follow that guy in front of you with a rifle, and when he gets shot, you pick up his rifle. So the Russians weren't alone in doing this, but the Russians, they had been doing these kind of things for 4 years. Not only that, the army was poorly led. Rennenkampf and Samsonov, the two commanding generals from the losing Russo-Japanese War, were also involved in this war. In fact, they lost the Battle of Tannenberg Lakes very badly. I mean, it's kind of interesting. The Russians actually had some success at first with against the Austrians, but then when they run up against the well-oiled Germans, they had no success. And in fact, it got so bad that of course, not to compare things, but like when the Bengals sometimes do poorly in the season, people come up with all sorts of novel suggestions to make the Bengals do better. That, like, for example, drafting this quarterback is suddenly going to turn the Bengals into a playoff franchise when it takes a whole lot more than that. And the same thing. One of the unique things that Tsar Nicholas II tried, they actually recruited a unit of women. And they put rifles in their hands and they put them on the front. And the idea was they were going to shame the Russian soldiers into doing better. It backfired, of course. Got a lot of women killed, and even though they fought bravely, but it didn't do anything for the morale of the army. So bottom line is, the Russians were truly the Keystone Cops of World War One. So, where are we at? Widespread, let's see, military and domestic failures produced massive casualties, widespread hunger strikes. Widespread hunger, I'm sorry, widespread hunger. There should be a comma there. Widespread hunger, strikes by workers, and disorganization in the army. In 1916, the Tsar once again dissolved the Duma, the Russian parliament. He then tried to rule Russia alone, as an absolute monarch would. But he was not Peter the Great, no. And all political factions in Russia were discontinued. In March of 1917, there were strikes and labor strikes and worker demonstrations which broke out in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, sorry. And the soldiers refused to fire on the workers. I mean, this is a major change. Remember, in the Revolution of 1905, in Bloody Sunday, there had been a peaceful demonstration to see the Tsar, and the army opened up on the marchers, killing hundreds. Well, here, the same thing was happening again, and this time the army refused to fire on the crowd under orders. And the Tsar said, I've had enough. And so he announced his abdication on March 15th, and the Russian government fell back into the hands of the old Duma, which had reconvened and formed a new government composed chiefly of constitutional Democrats. They were nicknamed the Cadets, and other Western sympathizers. Okay. Sorry. There. Pushing forward, forgive me. Yes. So, at the same time, various socialists within Russia, including the Social Revolutionaries, the Social Democrats, and of the Menshevik parties, morning, sir, began to organize the workers into Soviets, or councils of workers and soldiers. The Mensheviks were willing to work with the Constitutional Democrats in a liberal regime, but they became estranged when the cadets failed to control the army or purge reactionaries from the government. I mean, it was just a confusing time. You know, if Russia had ever been ripe for a takeover, it's right now. And the communists realized that. The provisional government that they set up remained loyal to Russia's allies and continued the war. What is it they say about the uttermost foolishness, that if you're in a difficult situation, you simply keep trying to do the same thing over and over again. Russia was losing the war, and this meant they just continued losing. There was, of course, the collapse of the last Russian offensive, however, changed this outlook. Disillusionment with the war, shortages of food and necessities at home, and growing demand by peasants for land reform undermined the government. This occurred even after the election of a moderate socialist by the name of Alexander Kerensky. Discipline in the army had fully disintegrated. Forgive me. Roman numeral 19. Ever since April, the Bolsheviks, remember that this was Lenin's faction of the socialist movement, the more militant faction. The Bolsheviks had been working against the provisional government. The Germans, who had hoped to cause trouble for Russia, had smuggled Lenin back into Russia, into St. Petersburg, in a sealed train for the purpose of Lenin coming in and destabilizing things. Lenin went right to work, speaking about, and you want to underline that, peace, bread, and land. Those were his mottos: peace, bread, and land, the things that the Russians wanted. The Bolsheviks said all political power should go over to the Soviets, the councils. You know, in 1922, Russia becomes the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Soviet means council, or the Soviet Union as it's called. Lenin fled to Finland, and his collaborator Leon Trotsky was imprisoned. for the short term. Trotsky was released from prison and organized a coup against the provisional governments. The Bolsheviks had assumed control of the government of Russia, and once again, it's very important you note they did this by organizing a very small group, but very tightly organized, very well organized. In no way, shape, or form were the communists, the Bolsheviks, ever a majority. This was not a sweeping revolution. It was a coup. So, Roman number 20, the victorious Bolsheviks then sponsored an election to select a new constitutional assembly. The social revolutionaries won a huge victory over the Bolsheviks, but that only lasted a day because one of the things the Bolsheviks controlled was the Red Army. Guns, yes. And drove the social revolutionaries out of power. All other political factions within Russia also ceased to function. In January, the Bolshevik government decreed that all land had to be nationalized and turned over to its peasant proprietors. Factory workers were put in charge of their own plants, banks were nationalized, and here, okay, this is a key element. The debt of the czarist government was repudiated and property of the church taken on by the state. The debt of the czarist government. The czarist government had, of course, incurred tremendous amounts of debt. And so one of the things that the Bolsheviks said, they repudiated. You say, what does that mean? They simply said, we don't owe that money. And see, that's very important. They just weren't going to pay that. Unlike the French Revolution, if you recall, the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution, they paid the debt. Why did the bourgeoisie pay the debt? Because a lot of it was owed to them. See, and yeah, but here the new Bolsheviks, they repudiated debt. They said it never existed. It's not going to get paid, and that didn't help the economic situation. And let's see, and also all the property, all the church property, was taken over by the state, and that was quite a haul. Church property, of course, doesn't just mean land. It means all the treasures that are located within churches, made of gold, silver, encrusted with jewels, those kind of things. So banks were nationalized. I'm sorry. The Bolshevik government also took Russia out of the war. Yes, took Russia out of the war, which they said only benefited capitalism. Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that the new Bolshevik government did, they said, no mas, Germany, it's over. You know, we're not fighting anymore. And the reason why the Bolsheviks did that, they just surrendered. They said, yeah, we're done, whatever, you know, and they're going to agree, the Russians are going to agree to a very bad treaty with the Germans. And why did they do that? Because they wanted to fix Russia. You know, the Bolsheviks, communists, the Bolsheviks understood that they needed to get out of that war so that they could focus on getting Russia under their control. Because remember, once again, the Bolsheviks were a small minority. And they figured they couldn't both wage war against the Germans, where they were losing so bad, and also turn around and wage war against their own countrymen. Because remember, most of the Russian population were either ambivalent about the communism, or they were dead set against it. And so, yeah, back to the matter at hand. So they dropped out of the war. Surrendered, basically. They surrendered to Germany. So on March 3rd, 1918, the Soviet Union accepted the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty was the treaty that ended the war for Russia. They surrendered. And the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, you know, they were very generous to the Germans, gave the Germans lots of territory, Poland mostly, and some of the Baltic states, territories given to Germany, as well as some serious money. Oh yeah, well here it is. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which ceded over to Germany, Poland, the Baltic states. And said, what are the Baltic states? Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. If you look on your map, there are the three states that line the rim of the Baltic Sea. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the Ukraine were handed over to Germany. Some territories, also from the Transcaucasus, went over to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, because remember, Russia was surrendering. The Bolsheviks also had to pay a heavy war indemnity, war reparations, money. That was a high price, but Russia was simply incapable of continuing the war and managing what was a coming civil war in Russia. Yeah, as soon as Russia, the Bolshevik government, gets rid of the World War I, they have to turn right around and fight a revolution, a civil war within Russia. So, forgive me. The Bolsheviks also needed to solidify their own control over their new government. Lenin believed that communism would soon overtake all of Europe. Until 1921, the new Bolshevik government fought a full-fledged civil war that was actually international. See, this is one of the things you don't see in a lot of your American history books, and you also don't see people talk about a lot. The great majority of the people of the United States don't know that after World War I, a civil war raged in Russia from 1918 to 1921. And probably you all said, well, why would they know that? Well, because American soldiers fought and died in that war. Oh, yeah. American soldiers, after World War I is all finished for the Americans begin sending units of soldiers to fight under British command in this Russian Revolution, trying to help the so-called White Russians, the so-called Mensheviks, the so-called Democrats, against the Bolsheviks. And they served in that war some 2 years, and lots of them died. Much of the war was actually fought above the Arctic Circle. In fact, one day I hope to go to Detroit. I've never really been. But in the middle of downtown Detroit, there is a monument, and it's called the Polar Bear Monument. And it's a monument to American soldiers, most of whom, interestingly enough, were immigrants literally right off the boat. And they were signed up to go and fight this war against the Bolsheviks. They lost big time, which is why you never hear about it. You know, we're kind of a country that doesn't like losing wars or talking about wars that we lost. Yeah, but yes, the Americans got involved with it. I mean, if you ever wonder why the Soviet Union, the communists and the Russians kind of look at us with like this, that's one reason. You know, our first opportunity, we try to stamp out the government. And I'm not saying their government's great, but you know, it's a part of the thing you don't hear about. So, however, these countries, including the United States, were too tired of war to invest much into what happened in Russia. The Red Russians, the Bolsheviks, and the White Russians supported a Western regime. The Americans, the British, the French, and several other countries, even the Germans, tried to form a coalition army to defeat the Red Russians. They really, and in the end, it turned out to be a disaster. The Red Army, in the summer of 1918, the Bolsheviks murdered the Tsar and his entire family. The Tsar's family had moved into a palace of sorts next to the Urals, and they were basically just wanting to, they abdicated, they wanted to, like, you know, get out of Russia and get out of that whole life. And the communists decided, the communist leadership decided that as long as the Tsar was alive, he was a danger to the communist movement. And so they made the decision to just get rid of him. They took the entire family, the Tsar, his wife Alexandra, the 5 children, the 4 girls, including Anastasia, the little boy, Alexei, and one of the servants and their dogs were taken down into the basement of the building under the ruse that they were going to take a photograph of the royal family. Well, the royal family knew that something was coming, and they also knew that probably what was going to happen. They figured that they would be deported, kicked out of the country. At any rate, they had their servants sew the crown jewels into the clothing of the little girl. All these jewels, diamonds, sewn into the lining of many of their clothes. And what they unwittingly did, I mean, they sewed so many of them in there. What they unwittingly did was to make a little bulletproof vest for all of them. And so they get them in there in this basement. They line them up against the wall, and then they start shooting at them. And they're not dead. You know, they're just, of course, it knocks them down, but they're not dead. Eventually, though, of course, they do kill them all. The dogs survived. They then took the bodies, hacked them to pieces, and then buried them underneath a road. You say, why didn't they do that? Go to all that trouble? Well, you have to remember that many religions, including some sects of Christianity, really get into icons, really get into relics. In other words, like, for example, the thorn relics, like the thorn crown that sat on the head of Jesus, the blood of Jesus, the head of John the Baptist, the tooth of the Apostle Paul, and those things like that. Well, same thing with the Tsar. They did not want to leave any trace of the Tsar so that people would have something to rally around in the future. And so, yeah, not only did they take their bodies, they chopped them in pieces, they buried them under a road, they kept it secret until, and it remained secret until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and they did some digging in archives, and sure enough, they went to the place described, exhumed the bodies, and did DNA testing on everybody, and they were all accounted for. No Anastasia escaped. All the children, all the Tsar's family, and 2 of the servants were, their body, it was them. They were dead and gone. And so, yeah. So, the Red Army, now under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, eventually placed themselves in full control of Russia. The collapse of Russia and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk were the high point of German success in World War I, because, I mean, from Germany's perspective, they had, reduced this to now a one-front war. They could focus all their efforts on the French, on the British, on the Western Front, and hopefully they can get it done before the United States start sending large masses of fresh soldiers in there. Because even though now they only had one front, I mean, the Germans were in the same position as the British and France, and that position was they were losing soldiers. And they were losing soldiers that could not be replaced. It is a fact, an amazingly strange fact, that not only in Germany after the war, but not only in France, not only in Great Britain, but in several of the countries who participated in World War I, that there were entire towns and villages after World War I in these 3 countries that had been totally depopulated of males, no males, between the ages of 13, 14, 15, and 15, 16. None. Why? Because they'd all been killed. You see, because one of the things that all the countries did back then, the British called it PALS battalions. When the British went and recruited soldiers for the war, they formed them up into PALS. You say, what is a PALS battalion? You get to serve with your friends. In other words, God forbid, heaven forbid, that we would get into a war, but the recruiter would say, oh, you can serve in the Army with all your buddies from Ryle High School that you hang out with. And the idea was, oh, if you're serving with your buddies, then you'll, of course, have more unity, more esprit de corps. And then, of course, they had this terrible policy, all the armies did, of keeping a unit on the front line, literally until the unit was used up. You know, for example, I don't know if you ever watched or read the book All Quiet on the Western Front. That's exactly what happens to the hero. Paul Baumer in All Quiet on the Western Front, he's a German soldier, a teenage boy. He just graduated from high school. He goes off to fight in World War I with the rest of his classmates. They're in the same unit. And by the end of the war, there's nothing left. And they all die one by one by one over time without relieving them. And yes, it was very common that they would put members of the same family in the same unit, wiping out entire male family members. And so, yeah, that was a thing. And the Germans were losing soldiers. They were getting thin as far as reserves. They didn't have any. More and more, for the Germans in particular, the front lines were manned by boys, younger and younger. It was not a good situation. And the morale was dropping, obviously. So, the collapse of Russia and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which Russia surrendered, were the high point of the German success in World War I. It was about this time that the United States entered the war. In fact, the United States declared war on Germany and its allies on April the 4th, 1917. They, meaning the United States, did not enter the war for about a year because, in 1917, there was no such thing. Oh, yeah, the United States had an army in 1917, and it was ridiculously bad. For example, the American Army in 1912, I believe it was. In 1912, there was this Mexican bandit. His name was Pancho Villa. And Pancho Villa led a band, I guess, of about 1,000 guys. And they would regularly cross the border from Mexico into southern Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, rob banks, shoot people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the United States said, we're going to do something about this. And so what they did, they sent the United States Army under General Blackjack Pershing into Mexico to chase this bandit. And they chased him for an entire year. Never saw him. Never found the guy. And in fact, there's a story, a legend, that talks about how one time Blackjack Pershing, when he was chasing Pancho Villa, came into this town, and went into the local cantina, the tavern, and he's sitting there at the bar drinking, and suddenly the bartender walks up and gives him a shot of tequila, and he says, "A gentleman has ordered this for you." And Blackjack, kind of looks around, shrugs, drinks the tequila, sits there a while longer, and a little bit later, the bartender comes back, another shot of tequila. And, Blackjack Pershing, oh, this is nice, drinks the second shot of tequila. And then finally, a little bit longer, same thing happens. The bartender comes, shot of tequila, you're an admirer of yours. And finally, Pershing said, who is this? And who's buying me all these drinks? And the bartender said, oh, it's Pancho Villa. And he points over in the corner, and nobody's sitting there. And that's a story. And it's interesting. But I mean, the biggest point of the matter was the United States Army was, not the most respected military in the world. To be real honest, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself because the same thing's going to happen. The United States government was so entrusting of its two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean, to protect its security. Every time the United States got into a war, They would get soldiers together, they would get equipment together, they would mobilize for the war, they would fight the war, and when the war was over, they always did the same thing. As soon as the war was over, they sent everybody home. They dismantled all the equipment. They sold all their horses. They, totally dismantled the army until it was just a skeleton. And discipline falls apart. They don't train as well. And so, the United States declared war on Germany on April 4th, 1917, but it was going to be a year before the United States really shows up and starts actually having an effect. But anyway, pardon me, hand sanitizer.
Shauna My House, please call room 222.
I bet that doesn't happen at your house. Anyway, they did not enter the war for about a year, and during that year, both sides tried to end the war before the Americans entered the fray. When I say that both the Allies, by this time, the British, French, and whoever else is called the Allies, and the Germans, the Austrians, and now the Ottoman Empire, because Italy has switched sides, are called the Axis, or the Central Powers. Both sides tried to end the war. You say, what does that mean, end the war? They tried to make peace? No. They tried to make the other side come to the bargaining table. The Allies' offensive failed miserably as the French army mutinied, and losses were heavy. The Austrians defeated the Italians, who had showed what great fighters they were. So in March 1918, the Germans also tried one last desperate offensive. The German army pushed the British and French back to the Marne River and got no farther. They had no more reserves. They had, they were putting children, and I'm talking about kids 13, 14 years old, a rifle in their hand, and giving them rudimentary training and sending them to the front. Their nation was exhausted. It was so exhausted. And tonight, I promise you, I'm going to send you that picture of the street scene in Munich, where you have this group of people dressed in very middle-class clothing. I mean, these aren't beggars. These aren't people wearing tatters. These are middle-class people, and there's a horse that has died on the street. What he died of, I don't know. Maybe he starved to death. They couldn't feed horses either. Horse that has died on the street. And these people are standing around, and you can see them. They are stripping this horse for its meat so that they can take back to their families and have something to eat. That's how effective the British naval blockade had been. It had just, decimated not only the war, taking soldiers out of the fields, the farming, but also it had just decimated Germany's ability to produce food. They couldn't buy food. And Germany was like, walking around on dead legs as far as the war went. Britain and France was too, for that matter. The Allies were bolstered by the American presence. They then launched a counteroffensive, which was finally successful. The Austrian front in the Balkans and Italy collapsed. Ludendorff felt that peace should be reached before the German army could be thoroughly defeated in the field, and that the responsibility for ending the war should fall upon civilians. Ludendorff allowed a government to be elected under democratic principles and to seek peace immediately. The new government was established under Prince Max von Baden, asked for peace based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. 14 points. Going to be hearing that a lot. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. But let's go back in time just a little bit and talk about the United States' entry into the war, which I should have talked about already. Here's the simple fact of the matter. To this very day, the largest ethnic group in this country are people of German descent. About 25% of the population. Irish are number 2, by the way. We English guys, 3. Although I think that's going to change in the next 50 years. But anyway, in 1918, it was the same. I mean, there were more people of German descent than any other people. And once again, so when the war gets started, nobody really knew who America was for. What begins to change during the course of the war, though, is that you see more and more of those incidents where the Germans were sinking transport ships that had civilian travelers, civilian passengers. And we already talked about that, why the Germans did that. They were desperate. But see, people don't understand that. And, so Germany, as time went on before the U.S. entered the war, began to lose more and more popularity. And the British were the absolute best country in the world at PR, public relations, propaganda. The British were very good at taking strategically placed photographs from the war of poisonous gas. They were very good at hyping up stories of atrocities against Belgian civilians, which, if they did happen, weren't nearly as bad or as vicious as the British portrayed them. And then there was this thing called the Zimmerman Note. The Zimmerman Note, Zimmerman, Zimmerman. The Zimmerman Note was a letter from the German Foreign Minister Alfred Zimmerman to the President of Mexico in the middle of World War I. And basically, the Zimmerman Note said the following. It was basically a series of if statements. Statement number one, if you enter the war on the side of Germany against the United States, basically the idea was to keep the United States tied down, at home. If you were to enter the war against the United States, for Germany against the United States. And here's the second if Germany wins, then as a bonus, when the peace treaty comes about, guess what you get as a prize? Why? If they did those things, if they joined in the war against the United States, if Germany won the war, then Mexico at the peace treaty would get as a prize all that land that Mexico had lost to the United States in the Mexican War of 1847. Well, how much land was that? Basically the western third of the United States. So next year, you're going to you'll be taking American history, and hopefully you'll learn about one of the great acts of American imperialism. I mean, if you ever wonder why the government of Mexico and the government of the United States don't get along with each other, it's quite simple. We've used them as our own personal punching bag for the last 200 years. Taking territory from them, taking Texas from them, and then picking a fight with them, and in that fight called the Mexican War, the United States, after we beat up Mexican, like, a bully taking a little kid's lunch money, we then took from them California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, parts of Wyoming, several other states. When you consider the fact that California today, California alone, if it were an independent country, California would have the 6th largest economy in the world. Yeah, that's quite a huge take. And so the German government saying, hey, if you get in this war with us and fight the Americans and keep the Americans tied up at home, when we win, you're going to get all that back. Now, the Mexicans really never considered that because they never got the letter. Why? Because the British had intercepted that letter and they held on to it. See, that's the thing. They intercepted that communique and then they held it. They didn't just, turn it right over because the letter was sent much earlier. No, they waited. They waited for an opportune time. And that opportune time came in the spring of 1917, when Germany announced that it was going to return to unrestricted submarine warfare. And that announcement, meaning that Germany would be sinking ships uncontrollably, that American civilians were going to die again uncontrollably, that announcement, and of course the Zimmerman note. In fact, the newspapers called the Zimmerman note a stab in the back and all these kind of things. Now, see, oh yes, one other thing I forgot to mention. British didn't release the note to the American government, because the American government, the leaders might have had the sophistication to know that there were communiques like that flying around all the time. I mean, the Germans were trying to persuade the Americans to fight on their side, for goodness sake. And, you know, there were all kind of letters and all kind of attempts by the warring parties in World War I to get allies for their side. But the British did not send that note to the American government. They sent it to the American newspapers. And of course, you know what the American newspapers do. The American newspapers live off news. The American newspapers, then as now, live off panic. If it bleeds, it leads. And so, yeah, those articles were published in the paper. You know, Germany's ganging up on us. Germany is, you know, stabbing us in the back. And yeah, there was a lot of sentiment then against the Empire of Germany. And so the United States does enter the war. And one of the more unfortunate things, I mean, is this is total war. And we'll find out what total war is, in that, for example, you know, where we live, the greater Cincinnati area is a German hotspot. I mean, you know, there are two major ethnic groups in the greater Cincinnati area. One are the Germans, the other is the Irish. And it suddenly became very unpopular to be German. Some of you may have English-sounding names, and I will guarantee you that some of you guys with names like Smith and Taylor and other names that sound really and have different spellings. For example, there's a lot of people in Northern Kentucky named Flesh, Flesh. Well, the German spelling is to have a C in there as well as, and also people whose name is Taylor, their name was originally Schneider, which is German, it means Taylor, or Smith became Schmidt, became Smith. And the reason for that, people were afraid. I remember visiting Mother of God Church down in Covington and hearing the curator talk about how one of their German priests was jumped and brutally beaten in Covington for being German. And later on, that same another German priest, the Monsignor of that church, which is Mother of God in Covington, the one with the big two green-looking domes, is a German church. It was a German-built church built in 1870. And the Monsignor of that church got a visit from an official of the United States government who said, "You stop having sermons in German." And the Monsignor, who himself was a very giant man. Well, how about that? Was that? Are you amazed? Was a very giant man. Stood up and he towered over this little government official and said, "German boys die in Europe. German families hear gospel in German." And that was all of it. But there was a lot. For example, they even banned the singing of the Christmas carol Silent Night. Because why? It was written by a German, actually written by an Austrian, but you know. So back to the matter at hand. Where are we? Roman numeral 23. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November the 9th, 1918. This marks the end of the Hohenzollern, Hohenzollern, Hohenzollern. Hohenzollern had been ruling Germany / Prussia for 300 years. They were the inheritors of the old Holy Roman Empire. And they, like the Romanov family in Russia, now come to an end. Like the Habsburgs in Austria, they come to an end. So, the majority branch of the Social Democrats now proclaim Germany a republic to prevent the establishment of a Soviet-style communist government under the dominion of a radical party like the Leninists, like the communists. 2 days later, the new government accepted the defeat of the German army in the war. And let me make a key point about this acceptance of defeat. When the German army surrendered, when they agreed to stop fighting, November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month of 1918. If you ever wonder why Veterans Day is Veterans Day, that's why, November the 11th. When the German army surrendered, and I'm going to say this about a zillion times more, when the German army agreed to quit fighting, agreed to lay down their arms, there was not, listen carefully, there was not one foreign soldier standing on German soil. And the Germans actually were occupying much of Belgium, much of France, and when they basically surrendered. In other words, yeah. This, you say, well, okay, so what, Mr. Wharton? They were, they would have eventually lost anyway. Yeah, and that's true, but you got to remember that in 20 some odd years, some little guy named Adolf is going to say, you know what? Your leaders betrayed you. Your leaders surrendered when you were winning. And people will believe that. That's the thing. People will believe that. And, there was, they occupied foreign territory. There was not a foreign soldier standing in Germany on November 11th, 1918, and they surrendered. And the Nazis later on will push the rumor that, your leaders did betray you. Okay, back to the matter at hand. So, the German people were unaware that their army was even losing at the time. That's the other thing. The German government was lying to its own people. They said that the war was going great. Yes, the war is costing a lot, but it's fine. We will win in the end, But of course, as time went on, as not only more and more casualties, boxes of dead soldiers were coming back from the front, the deprivations of war, the fact that you couldn't find food to save your life, began to hit home. Yeah. And then, of course, to find out at the very end, oh, yeah, we're sorry, we're losing. Yeah. That really destroys the faith of the German people in their own government. Many Germans actually expected a mild settlement from the war. In other words, they expected the war to be over. In fact, in every war prior to this, actually the loser, remember, the winner didn't destroy the loser. Say again, in every war prior to this, just remember the old balance of power thing. How at the end of the war, you just picked up your arms, you went home. You didn't want to totally destroy a government. You didn't want to totally destroy a country because that leaves a power vacuum. That, wait for it, upsets the balance of power. And that's exactly what is coming. So, many Germans believe that they've been duped by the end of the war. The victorious nations rejoiced, but it was a muted rejoicing with the great loss that accompanied the war. Casualties came to about 10 million dead and twice as many as that wounded. The victorious Allies, who had in 1914, let's see, 10 million dead, twice as many wounded. And by the way, that number, 10 million, that's soldiers. Civilians had just as many. And wait for it, Spanish flu, which we'll talk about a little. I mean, this text, most texts don't really talk about the Spanish flu, which is terrible. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up as a question, some questions on your AP exam. Right at the end of the war, and it's very interesting, came this Spanish flu. And it's called, and the Spanish flu, long story short, the Spanish flu came 1970, 1918, 1990, 19, and then it kind of frittered away. The Spanish flu will end up killing between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. Here's the ironic thing about it, and I may have told some of you guys this. I don't think I told all of you. The Spanish flu began in the United States of America, Kansas, of all places. In 19, look at that. In 1917, in Kansas, there was this farm boy. They cultivated a large number of poultry, and the flu came from, it was an avian flu. And the flu came from them. The boy was then recruited in the United States Army. He went to Fort Dix, where he infected other soldiers living in close quarters. And many of those soldiers then were crammed on the troop ships. And if you think cruise ships today are crowded and dirty, I mean, troop ships in World War I were packed like sardines in a tin can. And so, for example, there was one cruise ship that left the United States, and I don't remember the name of it, but it left the United States with 7,000 soldiers packed into that ship. By the time it crossed the Atlantic and got to Europe, it had 2,000 soldiers were infected, don't touch your face, infected with the Spanish, became known as Spanish flu, which is ironic. So why is it called the Spanish flu? Well, just like this thing we're going through now, the flu began to spread up and down the trenches. And then, of course, the worst thing possible happened. The soldiers went home and they took the flu with them. And as the war continued on, the flu made its way into Spain. Now, Spain was not participating. Spain didn't participate in World War I or World War II, for that matter. But no, Spain didn't participate in World War I. And see, all the countries involved in the war were experiencing. They were losing lots of people to this flu that nobody could understand, except that it killed people. But you see, none of the countries involved in World War I wanted to admit, oh yes, we also have a flu that's killing lots of people. And so, yeah, they didn't say anything about it until it got to Spain. In Spain, which is not involved in the war, reporters there began to notice death rates, and because of that, it simply became known that they were the first country to report it. They weren't involved in the war; it didn't matter, and so it got the name the Spanish flu, which also has a tinge of racism to it, because the idea that Spanish is so dirty. But back to the matter at hand. So yeah, that flu will come on board. The Great War had the following consequences: 4 million dead and 8.3 million wounded soldiers amongst the Central Powers. 5.4 million dead and 7 million from the Allies. The Ottoman, Russian, and German and Austrian empires were dismembered. Pardon me. I'm about to quit, I know. Or dismembered. So Ottoman, German, Russian, and Austrian empires were all cut apart. Americans entered the war and into European affairs like they never had before, and will never get out. And then the collapse of the Russian Empire brought communism into the mainstream, fascism to Germany and Spain and Italy. And you know what? I'm going to go over this again Monday. I know it's an hour. Let me say one thing, and then I'll quit. guess what has, here's a riddle for you. Guess what has 2 thumbs and it's going to sleep in tomorrow? So yeah, thank you for the 2 of you, or how many are staying attention, but and yeah, I'll close out and I'll come back to you Monday. It's been nice talking to you. Goodbye now.